Hello, everybody. Welcome to the launch this evening of Mira Robertson's Grace and Marigold, a fabulous book, which you'll hear more about as we go on. Just to begin, I would like to acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples and their custodianship of the lands and the waterways. The countries on which Spinifex offices are situated are Jiru, Bunurong and Wurundjeri, Warrawurrung, Bundungara and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom and the freedom of lesbians, often at the cost of their lives. So this evening, what we're doing, we're launching Grace and Marigold by Mira Robertson. I'll tell you just a little bit about Mira. She is a novelist and a short story writer, a screenwriter, and a script developer. And she's won prizes for her film scripts and her short stories. Her first novel was called The Unexpected Education of Emily Dean, and that was published in 2018. She's won and been shortlisted for short story prizes and been published in a range of literary magazines and received grants from the Australia Council and Arts Victoria. Always a good thing. She's worked in the film industry for many years and has written more than 10 feature films, as well as documentaries and some short films. Among the films that she's worked on with director Anna Kopinos are Only the Brave and Head On, both of which won awards, including prizes for scripts. She got an AFI for Best Script for Only the Brave and an Augie for Best Adapted Script for Head On. She's also had shows on SBS TV. She's taught fiction and screenwriting at Melbourne University and RMIT, as well as Victoria University. And before she became, this is always the really interesting bit, what did people do before they became writers? She worked in a range of jobs in the community sector of local government as a union industrial officer with the Australian Services Union, and she also consulted on industrial issues for the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association, as I called Harne, researching and advising on the creation of a national industrial law. I first met Mira back in, I think it was 1974, when we both happened to be working in running festivals, but that's another story. Our first speaker this evening, so that's Mira. Our first speaker this morning is Lynne Harne. Lynne has been a radical lesbian feminist since the 1970s. She's a founding member of the Lesbian Rights Alliance, which is a group campaigning to prevent lesbian erasure. Very necessary. She's also coordinator of the Lesbian History Group events in London and co-editor of the book All the Rage, Reasserting Radical Lesbian Feminism, which was published by Spinifex in 2021 as an ebook. And she contributed to the anthology Not Dead Yet in 2021, which was edited by Renata and I, and has published other books and articles on violence against women and girls. And then onto Elaine. So Elaine is a founding member of the Lesbian Rights Alliance, which was formed to challenge the disappearance of lesbian existence and to promote lesbian culture and radical feminist politics, and an activist fighting policy capture of education and health by trans ideology. She's also key in enabling the continuation of the Lesbian History Group. She came to England from Australia in 1973 and travelled to Europe and Morocco and in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1978 wrote a thesis on Doris Lessing and was a member of the collective that formed the Tyneside Rape Crisis Centre There she discovered the joys and turmoil of lesbian friendship and community and never looked back. She was a member of Only Woman Press in the 1980s and edited a book on lesbian fiction for the Women's Press in 1998, which is called Beyond Sex and Romance, The Politics of Contemporary Lesbian Fiction. And she also contributed to Not Dead Yet. So I'm now going to hand over to Lynne to begin speaking.
Right, thank you. I'm mainly going to talk about the two characters in the title, Grace and Marigold. But just to say, the context of the book is set around the squatting movement in the early 1970s, and I myself was involved in squatting at the time, so it's interesting to see how it's represented. So I'm going to start with the character of Grace. The book initially focuses on Grace's character, and she's left Australia to escape the control of her parents and her university friends who have joined with women's liberation groups. Grace herself, who's only 20 years old, comes over as a naive personality, and she believes that she can get away from an Australian identity and reinvent herself in London. And like her friends in Australia, she did not attend women's liberation groups and has not bothered to read any of the women's liberation groups' books, such as The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir or Germaine Greer's book, The Female Eunuch, although at one point she does quote from that book. So throughout the book, as her character, she seems quite uncertain, and she's unsure what she believes in, and often just accepts the views of others. In Australia, she discovered she was attracted to other women, but because of being fearful of being identified as a lesbian or a dyke in England, she wants to prove that she is heterosexual to Marigold, but at the same time, she remembers she does not like heterosexual sex. She meets up with Marigold after treading on some dog shit, and Marigold introduces her to living in the squat, and she discovers a mixture in the squat. She discovers a mixture of hippie ideology. Most of the residents smoke dope, and a sort of Marxist ideology, which is struggling for freedom. So as they get to know each other, Grace feels she loves Marigold as a romantic friend, and Marigold helps Grace to learn about French films and to apply for a job in a publishing house. But she encourages Grace to submit an application where she makes up the degree she's got in literature, and she lies about her other skills, so that she gets, in order to get an interview. But when she does actually get the job, she's very confused about what she's supposed to be doing. And instead of asking questions about what her job means, she mismanages her work and ends up losing a manuscript. She's supposed to be reading for possible publication. Towards the end of the book, Marigold often disappears, with Grace wondering where she is and if she's with an old lover or is involved in some mysterious work. But having found out that there is actually a separatist lesbian squats, Grace finally decides that she knows her own mind and realizes that she is a lesbian. She therefore rejects the offer of living with Gerald, who's the sort of supposed leader of the squat, although the squat isn't supposed to have any leaders. And she says that she wants to move from the mixed sex squat, and she decides that she wants to live with other lesbians. And I'll stop there and hand over to Elaine.
Okay. Thanks. What I want to do is in a way develop some of the things Lynne said, because I think that I love this novel and I think it's very well structured. So I'll try to point out, I realise some of you may not have read it, so we're trying not to give away key points. But anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to be involved in launching it, because for me, it evokes so much. The new Aussie arriving in UK with little idea what to do once here, meeting the travelling Aussies with their overland and magic bus tales, and the nostalgia of home intruding. I think it's a very subtle novel in the way it traces Grace's tortuous coming out experiences, which will be familiar to a lot of lesbians, fantasizing about a relationship with a heterosexual woman, but unable to tell her. I'm not gay either, she tells Marigold. Following on from what Lynne said, I'll comment on a few specifics in the book. In the early stages, as Lynne said, Grace goes along passively with whatever is presented to her. In the squat, she absorbs and earnestly repeats all the dictums and cliches without really understanding their significance, but desperate to mould herself into a Beltonian as this was her new life. When she meets the Australian tourists at Bush House, when she goes to collect mail, she pretends to them that she's at the centre of the squat rather than a passive participant. By the time they reached the head of the queue, her life had become as thrilling as anything in a novel. And in this way, Mira undermines Grace's pretensions humorously and affectionately. And this is a pattern in the writing. It shows Grace's vulnerability, but we hold our breath for her in what she's going to say next. And by the way, Kathy and Janine from Bendigo and Brisbane are so taken in by what she actually says, that they want to come and live in this squat, and she has to sort of find ways of putting them off. I found that whole episode really amusing. Right, though Grace tries to detach herself from the past, it creeps up to bite her with sudden memories of the poems Clancy of the Overflow and I Love a Sunburnt Country, poems Aussies, or at least in Melbourne, all learnt in primary school. By the way, Dorothea McCullough, the poet of I Love a Sunburnt Country, I just found out, wrote the poem while she was on a trip to England in 1906, when she was clearly missing her homeland. But Grace's yearning for the Australian landscape, despite her best efforts, ring true, as do her memories of home and her parents. More of her character is revealed in both the flashbacks to her Australian life and her present musings and conversations with her new friends, and also in the horrifying encounter group. We see that much as she tries to demonize her parents, determined they'll play absolutely no part in her new life, she doesn't succeed in dismissing them so easily. Now, Marigold, she's the character that gives the novel its intrigue. She's confident, compelling, enigmatic. There's a very significant scene in the novel, the trip to the film Céline and Julie Go Boating. This is a central turning point, both in their relationship and in the novel. Marigold's a fascinating character to us as well as to Grace, I think. The squatters, now they provide a perfect backdrop for Grace's awakening. At first, they appear indistinguishable from each other, except for the leader Gerald, though there are no leaders. But throughout the novel, they develop characteristics and identities. You've got the Frenchman, Raymond, the busker, Annie, the encounter group enthusiast, Vanessa, and Martin, the seeker after personal enlightenment. And Ingrid stands out from the beginning, never going along with the group ethos. They nurture and care for each other, and this is built up beautifully, sort of cooking meals, having meetings, and they're politically committed to helping homeless people, helping house homeless people. Some of them, others aren't quite so committed. But crucially, in terms of the plot, they provide a link to the various scenarios in the London of the time for Grace to experience. And I think that's very well constructed how that happens. There are amusing scenes here as well. They've got a communal backyard because they broke down all the fences in the street. And it's full of nettles and rubbish and weeds, but nevertheless, they intend to build a bench in the sun for old people, though we're told no one over 30 had ever shown a desire to live in the free republic. There are lots of throwaway comments like this, which make the novel really funny. And the travelling Aussies provide more of the humour. In the Earl's Court Youth Hostel, despising the shithouse English beer, or fresh from their overland adventures, easy to spot half-frozen, skinny, sun-browned bodies draped in flimsy, brightly coloured clothes, mouthing half-baked ideas of spirituality and Buddhism fresh from their experiences in India. And the other side of the coin is how Grace is seen, where irritating concepts about Australia and Australians are aired. Her job interview, for instance, contains such extraordinary questions as, had she ever been bitten by a snake or a redback spider? And don't come the raw prawn, the don't come the raw prawn phrase from the horrible Barry Mackenzie film, quoted incorrectly, surfaces here to Grace's discomfort. And this has added resonance as she's deceived them with her job application. And don't come the raw prawn means don't deceive me. There are many other notable characters and side stories in the novel. Rita, Simon, Gerald, Ingrid. The author juggles them all seamlessly as a backdrop to Grace's development. Towards the end, though, she develops and she's shown to think for herself. She's ashamed of her shabby treatment of the Buddhist spouting women, Kathy and Janine, and she affectionately tackles Gerald's sexism right towards the end. And she's corrected herself to think woman instead of girl, because girl was infantilizing, and that's her own thought here. She's not being corrected by Marigold. So I found Grace a really appealing character, because the author allows us access to all her thoughts, pretensions, and actions, comic at times, inducing our sympathy in others. So, for instance, she appears vulnerable sometimes. She takes on Marigold's contempt of the film when she talks to Rita, thereby denying her own feelings. She says the French are so pretentious. That's what Marigold thought, not what she thinks. So for me, the whole story rings true of a lesbian not really knowing how to come out, as there's no context when she first arrives in England. The only models she has, outside of her memories in Melbourne, are Sister George, Stephen Gordon, and the butchers that Marigold points out to her outside gateways, who terrify her. But what rings true towards the end of the novel is a glimpse into the future. Women's collectives, potential job with a women's press, and chaotic experiments with monogamy and non-monogamy are hinted at right at the end. The early manifestation of the women's liberation movement in the UK, which we all know so well. So I've just highlighted a few instances. There's so much more. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Mira's got to say about the novel, and I'm delighted that Spinifex published it, because I think it's a terrific novel. It's really funny and really interesting, and it keeps you gripped all the way through. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Over to you, Mira.
Right. Well, thank you, Lynne and Elaine, for your comments and thoughts about my novel, which I found really interesting. And many thanks also to Susan Hawthorne and Renata Klein and everyone at Spinifex for publishing the novel and for all the work you've done. So, in thinking about what I wanted to say about the novel, I thought I'd start with the question that writers almost always get asked by readers, and that is, where did the story come from? I lived in London for about 6 years in the 1970s, and I was 20, exactly the same age as Grace when I arrived. And without that history, I wouldn't have written this novel. And a lot of details come from my memories of that time, although the overall story is fictional. But there's obviously a lot more to it just than the fact that I lived in London for some years, because I've lived in Melbourne for about 50 years, and so far it's only received a few passing references in my work. So I need to dig a bit deeper. The combination of time and place and the fact that I was 20 when I arrived in London as central. It was such a fascinating, liberating place, and to encounter it when I was young, as a young adult, at the stage of life when you are coming to grips with who you are and what you want to be, it had a huge influence on me. And in my first novel, it was also a sort of coming out novel, completely different sort of thing. But I think that there is something in me that is attracted to that, not coming out, but coming of age kind of narrative. And although I think you can do that at any time through life, I think it's especially resonant in early adulthood. So when I began writing Grace Marigold, I didn't know where it was going to take me or how closely it would mirror my own past. But I knew that Grace's struggle with her sexuality had to be a central theme. And although a lot of the details of the actual story are not autobiographical, they are fictional, the psychological and emotional level of the story, or in terms of Grace, I really drew on my own experiences. The whole issue of internalized homophobia is something I suffered from, and it was something I knew that I wanted to explore. Grace, as I think especially Elaine has really sort of articulated, has absorbed all the prejudice and negativity of that time or coming into that time, and she ravages herself with that. As a character, she's full of contradictions. She's passionate and quite smart, but she's also really insecure, wanting to fit in, always molding herself to what she thinks is cool, tormented by the idea of being different. And the big difference in her case is about sexuality and not being able to bear the thought of being that she might be a lesbian. And, I didn't want to make it a story whereby she was facing these enormous obstacles and it was all externalized. In fact, really, she's in a situation where it would be quite easy for her to come out. There's no terrible discrimination that she's facing in her immediate sort of situation. And really, no one in the squat would probably care two hoots either way if she came out as a lesbian. But that doesn't make it any less intense for her, because it's all happening inside her head, as it was in mine. And that's what she has to deal with, and that's what I really wanted to explore. And of course, she's on the other side of the world. She's away from everything that she's known, everything that's familiar to her, and that makes it, I think, more intense. So as I said, London for me in the 70s, I found it an amazing place, especially being 20 years old and having never been out of the country before. So everything was on a massively bigger scale for a start. But it was also a period of sort of turmoil, really, because there were strikes, rising unemployment, there was a lot of homelessness and ferment from both the hard, from the National Front, the right, and also from the revolutionary left. Not that I was aware of that really initially, but it was such a sort of time where lots of things were happening. And then there was the liberating freedom of squatting offered, and that was really central to my experience, and so it's central in the book as well. The idea of living rent-free, creating everything from scratch, and that meant learning how to do all kinds of things like plumbing and plastering and even electrics. And honestly, it is a miracle that I'm alive to tell the tale because of some of this, incredible things that we actually did, and the fact that I wasn't electrocuted. So we lived communally, experimenting with sexual freedom and non-monogamy, group therapy. I think Elaine mentioned something about an encounter group. Yes, there's a fairly terrifying experience there. And a bit of drug taking as well, as we tried to work out who we were, all set against this backdrop of the radical political movements of the era. Not everyone survived or thrived, that's for sure. And that's something I also touch on a little bit in the novel. And then there's Grace's job as a Girl Friday at Primo Press, again, something she gets through making up a whole lot of nonsense about what she'd actually done with Marigold's help. But it's not what she expects, and she's thrown in the deep end, and I'll say a bit more about that later. So really, in the end, I started with these two elements, the world of alternative 70s London and the idea that Grace needed to come to terms with her sexuality. And that was enough to get me going and enough to feel like I had the basis for a novel. The squat that Grace moves into is in the Free Republic of Beltonia, which I loosely based on a street of squats in West London, where the squatters got together to stop a threatened eviction by seceding from the UK and forming the Free and Independent Republic of Frestonia. That's the true version of it. It was a symbolic act which got them a lot of press and notoriety, and there were all kinds of interesting people involved: actors, musicians, writers, and a group of my friends that included the photographer Tony, who published a terrific book of his photographs of Frestonia. If anyone is interested, he published that a couple of years ago, and I'm sure it's still available. There are 7 other people in Grace's squat in Beltonia, and they're all characters we get to meet and who play various roles in her life. And this Gerald, the de facto leader of the squat, is important because Grace thinks he's going to be the one to save her from a life in the shadows, which is what she thinks awaits her if she's a lesbian. She knows things have changed and that it's not like it was, before, but she can't get the well of loneliness and George out of her head. And she really feels that would be a terrifying fate. So the novel's title is Marigold, and so I should briefly say something about Marigold, but actually I don't want to say much because I think it's important for readers who haven't read the book yet to come to her without too many preconceptions. When I've finished speaking more generally, I'll read the first meeting between her and Grace to give you a flavour of her. But just to say that I knew I had to create someone who would challenge Grace and put pressure on her and also be from a very different world. So she's English, upper class, and I think both Elaine and Lynne said something about her being enigmatic, and that is true. The other important setting in the book is Primo Press, where Grace gets a job as a Girl Friday. And I have to say that I did have a job as a Girl Friday in a place a little bit like Primo Press, which you might find surprising because it is a fairly extraordinary place. It takes her out of the Free Republic of Beltonia and into another world, and nothing about it is what she expects. And really, she's pretty clueless in the job, despite the fact that she's not dumb, but part of her problem is not wanting to appear stupid and therefore not asking for help. She's also intimidated by her immediate boss, Rita, who, for reasons that eventually become clear, has it in for her. The big boss, Simon, is a womanizer, but despite this, she allows herself to become rather entangled with him. In fact, I think the scenes between Simon and Grace, I really enjoyed writing them, I have to say, and I think that, and they amuse me, and I hope they'll amuse you, until they don't, because there is a point where they don't. One of the things I was interested in exploring within the context of Primo Press was about the workplace culture and how the sexual politics of the time operated. I mean, it's only one workplace, and I'm not saying that it's a model for how things work generally, but I do think there are elements that most women who will feel familiar, it will feel familiar to most women, or a lot of women. The workplace dynamics and the sexual politics of the 70s were pretty daunting, especially when you were young and female. And unfortunately, we know that those dynamics are not a thing of the past. And I just want to say one thing about the coming out aspect of the novel, because obviously things have changed a lot since the 1970s, and most of that for the better, depending, of course, on where you live, because we know there are many parts of the world where that's not true. But I think for us, coming to grips with one's sexuality is still often traumatic and difficult, no matter really what your sexuality is. I think Grace is living in a very specific time and place, but her journey is a very human one, and I think in that sense it's timeless. And I was going to make a comment, and I'll still make it, that you might be thinking this is all feeling a bit, serious and dark. But I think Elaine has certainly sort of let you in on the fact that it's actually, there is a lot of humor in the book and a lot of lightness. And that was important to me because I really want people to enjoy my work. And I want that humor to come through. So one of the other things that I'm often asked, because I've written film scripts, is about the difference between writing for the screen and writing a novel. So I thought I'd just say a few things about that. First of all, writing a novel, you're in control, and there's really a freedom in that which you don't have to the same degree when you're writing a script. They're much more of a collaboration because you've got all these other people, notably the director, telling you what they want and what you should be doing. And there are also producers and financiers, and everybody has some sort of input. And I guess it's a lot to do with the fact that films and TV cost such a lot to make, and it changes that dynamic between art, the art versus commerce dynamic. That's not to say, of course, that publishers don't want to make money too, but I think it's a slightly different scale. So there are other ways in which the two forms differ, and I thought I'd just talk briefly about how the actual process for me is so different. Because I start a novel with characters and I only ever have a vague idea what it's about. And really, in terms of the plot, I have no idea. I have to write it to find out. So in that sense, I'm what some writers call a pantser and not a plotter. Pantser being short for seat of the pants. So when you're writing scripts, you actually do the opposite. You do all this working out of the story and the theme and the plot early on so that you can go to the funding bodies and ask for money to actually get paid to write. And that's, strangely enough, it seems to work for scripts, or in my case, it worked for scripts. But for novels, I'm much more, I have to write into the darkness, groping my way forward and searching for what it is that I'm really trying to say and how to say it. I read something recently that Australian writer Amanda Laurie says, and she talks about writing like cat burglars, trying to crack the safe, twisting the dial this way and that, waiting to hear the click. And that's definitely me. And I have to say, it's not an efficient method because you're always going down false leads and taking wrong turns, but it's the only way that's worked for me so far. And I think that you just have to bear with it and know that, if you keep at it, you'll find the answers. I think perhaps if you're writing crime or romance, it's probably easier and maybe even essential that you have to work out the plot first. But I've never found it to be useful for me. But there are a few other ways in which screenwriting has influenced me. And it's hard to know, what sort of writer I would have been if I hadn't had those years of experience. People often tell me that they can really see everything in my novels. They can kind of imagine the whole scene and visualize it. So I always think I'm quite skimpy on description, but I think there's something in my writing that means that it sort of has a visual aspect to it. And that's no doubt come from script writing. I also think that dialogue is something that I practiced a lot as a screenwriter because you have to. And so that's one thing I'm actually pretty good at, but I also think I have to be aware of not overusing it. And I guess screenwriting's also helped me to make multidimensional and memorable characters who are contradictory but still believable, not wholly good or bad. they're all things you learn anyway as a writer, but I suppose I've learnt them through screenwriting. And I think finally it's also helped me to be more open to hearing feedback at various draft stages, because you've got to do that with screenwriting, even though it's sometimes frustrating and takes you off track. But I think it's also liberating and really helpful. And getting feedback on drafts of the novel is always a really great time, and you always improve the work, and it helps to make the work better. I think that's pretty much all I'm going to say, but now I would like, if there's time, maybe to read an excerpt from the novel where Grace first meets Marigold. I'll apologise in advance because I'm not going to try Marigold a sort of upper-class English accent. That would be sort of very weird. So she's going to have an Australian accent in this version. And also there's a bit of swearing, so hopefully no one is too going to be put off by that. And we pick up Grace after she's been in London for a month, renting a room in a squalid house with a very unpleasant young landlord called Joel, and she is, not surprisingly, rather depressed. Okay, I may have to put my glasses on for this, I think. That fateful afternoon, she was trudging along in her usual aimless way, feeling sorry for herself, not caring where she was going because it was all the same. Dreary, run-down houses and concrete footpaths. The London of Buckingham Palace and Westminster Cathedral, the Houses of Parliament, the art galleries and museums, the glamour of the West End was a world away. She was too depressed. And anyway, she hadn't come to London to be a tourist. But even in the midst of her misery, she was determined not to admit defeat and go home. She had to soldier on. Sometimes she cried as she walked, not caring who noticed. Nobody ever spoke to her anyway, which was why when a female voice called out, "Watch out," she muttered, "Fuck off," under her breath, only to feel something squelch under her shoe, followed by the unmistakable reek of dog shit. Don't say I didn't warn you. The shit on her shoe and the criticism of the girl who made it were the last of many straws, and she burst into tears. The critical girl introduced herself as Marigold. She was 25 and said girl was infantilizing. She was a woman, although that discussion came later when she and Grace had got to know each other. With long reddish hair and pale translucent skin, she reminded Grace of a pre-Raphaelite painting, Ophelia in her watery grave or the Lady of The resemblance, as she soon found out, was superficial because Marigold was the opposite of a palely loitering heroine. Nor was she draped in flowing robes, wearing instead black tights and a man's long striped shirt, tied at the waist with a silk scarf. Chunky black work boots completed her outfit. The dog poo incident had taken place outside a shabby terrace house. Marigold made Grace take off the offending shoe and come through to the back garden. She filled a bucket with water and found a twig for scraping off the shit, which she gave to Grace as there were limits to the help she was prepared to offer. "Bravo," she said when it was done. Embarrassingly, Grace couldn't stop crying. "It's not the poo," she croaked. "It's all the other things." "What other things?" Marigold demanded. In normal circumstances, Grace would never have blabbed to a complete stranger, but circumstances were not normal, and once she began, it was impossible to stop. Marigold listened and didn't say anything, the expression on her face becoming more and more severe. "I'm really sorry. I know I've bored you with my tale of woe," Grace said, feeling mortified that she'd gone on for so long and regretting the phrase tale of woe, which made her sound weirdly old-fashioned. She felt sure Marigold was judging her. "Don't be stupid. I'm not bored," she said. "We're going there right now to get your belongings. You're moving in here. But Joel will do exactly as he's told." They went straight upstairs to Grace's room, where Marigold instructed her to pack everything. She'd almost finished when Joel appeared and blocked the doorway, demanding extra rent as compensation for the lack of notice. Grace was ready to capitulate immediately. "Oh, I don't think so," Marigold said. She smiled at Joel in a friendly way and wandered across to the platform bed. "Gosh, what a lot of storage you have." "So what?" he said. "I told you, you're not leaving until she's paid the rent." Fire hazard, I would have thought, she said, turning towards him. As Marigold lunged at Joel, Grace heard the metallic click of a Zippo lighter. A blue flame shot up, hair sizzled, and an acrid stench filled the air. "What are you doing, you mad bitch?" he screamed. "You fucking burnt my hair. And you're a fucking slum landlord." She followed him, flicking the lighter on high as he backed away. "It's us should be demanding the rent money." At the door, he screamed that he was going to fucking break her fucking legs before bolting up the stairs to his top floor flat. "And don't come back," she called. Outside on the pavement, she grabbed Grace by the hand and pulled her along. They ran down the street, Marigold whooping. Grace wanted to join in, but her pack was thumping up and down, hitting her in the small of the back, and all she could do was gasp for the next breath. And so we meet Marigold.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. I want to reread the book immediately. That was fantastic. And I mean, as everybody, as Elaine and Lynne and you have said, you know, that particular period in London was fantastic. I went to London in 1976 and also lived in a squat for a while, in a lesbian squat actually, as so many Australians did. You know, because who could afford to, you know, rent a place? You know, the prices were just ridiculous. So yeah, you know, I mean, does anybody want to make a comment or whatever? We've got about 5 minutes. If anyone does want to say something, you can either raise your hand or write something in the chat and I can read it out. But so far, nothing. Elaine, you want to say something, Lynne? Oh, look, you've driven us to silence. No, truly, that was a great section to read of the book. It really was. It was brilliant. And actually, you almost did the Marigold type accent, not quite, but yeah. So, well,
Yeah.
Elaine.
Okay, no, I just wanted to add, I think when I first read it, I emailed Renata and said how much I loved it and how much it rang bells, not of my experience, which was different, but I'd just like to state that I can still recite Clancy of the Overflow and I Love a Sunburnt Country right through. I even taught Clancy of the Overflow to Lynne at one point, and Australians, that'll mean something too, but I loved all those references and also the thing about missing Australia, because I've lived here for 55 years, I think, and I still miss Australia, you know, miss the smell of gum trees, etc. And I do think, and the things you said, or she encountered right at the beginning with the warm beer, or hate everything English. I mean, when I was hitchhiking in Europe, I came across loads of Australians like that, and I think you've captured it to a T. Just that, and I just have to confess, I travelled around Europe with someone named Gary, and we called our van Bruce, because there's a Gaza and a Bruce in the novel. So I just related to it on a very personal level. But anyway, I'll shut up. But I do think it's a terrific book, and I urge everyone to buy it who hasn't. Okay, that's all.
Phil Long has written in the chat. The novel sounds great and I can't wait to read it. Love the extract that Mira read, so evocative. Thank you, Julia. You want to say anything?
Well, obviously I haven't read it, so oh, hi everyone. Anyway, yeah, I haven't read it yet, but I really am looking forward to. So I'm kind of just here to listen, but yeah, just to say thank you. And I thought Lynne and Elaine gave such a flavour of it, you know, in their introduction, and it was just a real treat hearing that extract. And also it was interesting as well, Mira, hearing, you know, your experience of you know, writing, you know, the screenwriting and the novel writing. That was really interesting. So yeah, I'm so glad. I just feel really lucky that I'm off work this week, and otherwise I wouldn't have been able to join. So yeah, just to say thank you, really.
you. Thank you.
Right.
Any more comments from anyone before we move to our thank yous?
Can I just comment? Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
I just the whole account of the squatting movement and what went on there is just really good because although my experience of squatting was squatting with other lesbians and that there were different places in London where there were different squatting areas, if you like, but things like learning how to stop the electricity being counted and learning all those. We learned a lot of skills when we were squatting in what would now be called women in manual trades and how to actually survive with those skills as well. And we go to evening classes about electricity or how to service your car and so on. So all those aspects came up when you were squatting, and it was sort of very valuable. But obviously a different experience from if you were Australian.
We've also got a couple of other comments. Vicky says it was compulsive reading, and Jo also says she will be reading it. And somebody else, Kathy Chambers, asks, Mira, was the encounter group based on your own experience or?
Oh, God.
Yeah, I'll answer that, and I'll make a confession. It was, but look, the truth is that I got right into the encounter movement stuff for a while because I think it gave me a language to sort of deal with with all my problems at the time. But I felt like Grace had a different take on it to me. But that encounter group was pretty, like that. I think people who experienced encounter groups at the time would tell you that whether you were into it or whether you weren't, it's a pretty truthful portrayal of it. And I know that a number of people have said to me that when they get to that chapter, they just freak out. They just find it quite horrendous. But yeah, in a good way, in an interesting way. Yeah.
I heard about encounter groups, but I didn't ever go to one. But what I knew about encounter groups, that seemed like the sort of thing that went on.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
It's almost embarrassing to say that, I actually, did really kind of get into it for a while, but that's the truth. And I mean, I think, it was all part of what was. It's just in the air, honestly, that it was because we were living communally too. So like most everyday life was a bit like an encounter group, really, because you were dealing with so many different people and different people wanting different things. And and nobody held back, I can tell you.
Yeah, it was a time to have many experiences. I didn't have that one, but I had a lot of other weird ones.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah. Well, Renata, do you want to come in?
Muted.
Calling Renata.
Disappeared.
Okay.
It is.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. That was very enjoyable. And I learned actually quite a bit. And Mira, what you said about the difference between writing novels and scripts, that was really very interesting. Me not being a fiction writer, or a script writer, I found that really interesting. So let me just do thank yous. First of all, to Lynne and Elaine. It was really good to have you because, I mean, you were living through that period in England, and one of you is an Australian like Elaine, and so that was good to have your words on that. And I'm very, very pleased that you liked the book, and also for Vicky and Cassie from Australia to like it is really good too. It is a very, very good read, and we had a good time. working on the book. Then after Elaine and Lynne, I of course really want to thank Mira for writing the book. I mean, Mira is a perfectionist. There were quite a few drafts. And I remember the encounter group at the beginning was terribly long. Do you remember? And I kind of said, oh, that is getting a bit too far. And then you actually cut it, and it's better now. Now, the person who really helped with the editing was Pauline forget her name, Pauline Hopkins, who is fantastic and obviously can't be here today because she works in the readings bookshop shop in Hawthorne, for those of you who are in Australia. She was fantastic to work on the book, and we had a very good time. The other thing, which was you don't know, is that the book went through quite a few titles. I can't even remember them, but definitely Grace and Marigold is absolutely the best. It just fits. And I think my favorite character in the book is actually Marigold, actually even more so than Grace. And we can't talk about what happened. You have to read the book. You really have to read the book.
Yes.
You have to buy multiple copies of the book and give it to all your friends for Christmas. It's such a book. Everybody wants to read it. So then after having thanked Pauline and Mira, of course, and of course I want to thank Susan, because Susan also was co-editing the book as well. And without Susan, very little happens at Spinifex, because books don't just fall from heaven. It's not just like you have a manuscript and then it's a book, bingo. No, it doesn't work quite like that. There's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of time it takes. There also needs to be a cover done. And the cover was also a bit of a saga. We had endless covers, and we changed between covers of the flats, covers of the squats, covers of this and that and the other, until our wonderful designer Day put us all our covers, and she was so kind, and she never said she came very close to saying it's enough now. She then came out of the blue with those boots, and in a way they really cover they cover exactly what the book was about. So thank you to Deb Snipson for a wonderful cover. Also, when you open the book, you see that it is very beautifully set, and we proud ourselves at Spinifex that our books are always really look good. And Helen Christie is the magic fairy behind doing our book designs. And then, of course, the books have to be talked about and have to be distributed about and have to, get reviews as much as that possible, because neither being a lesbian or particularly being in the 70s in London is like the topic of the day. But Rachel McDermott, who's our wonderful distributing guru, has managed to get a few things. And actually, I think there will be... should maybe not say it aloud, but it looks like there could be a review in the Age and the Sydney Herald, Morning Herald next weekend, which is doesn't happen that often. It will be a tiny little review, but a tiny little review is better than nothing. So the last person I want to talk is Caitlin, who is our social media manager, who lives in Perth and does also a really good thing on talking our books up on Instagram, on TikTok, and X. And of course, no, I have forgotten somebody, and that's Danielle, our office manager, who then sends the books out when heaps of people order them. So, don't be shy, order the book based on the Spinifex website, but you can also go to your bookshop and say, order that book, order 10 copies of that book. So every lesbian in the world will want to read that, not in the world, in your particular street. So I also want to say to you, those of you who are not subscribers to our newsletter, please subscribe to our newsletter. If you go on the Spinifex homepage, it's right there, because then you get all the announcements of what books we're producing, what Zooms we're having. Like, for instance, in 2 days' time, we will have another Zoom launch of the latest book by Vandana Shiva, famous ecologist, environmentalist, and ratbag. And it's called The Nature of Nature. And she will be speaking to us from the East Coast in America. So if you're a member of our newsletter, you will know that that's happening. And then at some point, we will actually, that's the book that Sue's holding up. And then we will also have a Zoom launch of Susan's new book, which is called aptly Lesbian. Have you got a copy of that, Sue? And it's just come to us yesterday from the printer.
But you probably
Hold it up a bit.
And I don't know.
Hold it up a bit.
Up.
And it's and those of you who are Australian will immediately recognize that the artwork on Susan's book title is from Suzanne Bellamy, who very, very sadly died a couple of years ago. And it's a beautiful title, and it's full of lesbian stories that Susan has written over the last 50 years. So it's another must. What?
Essays more than stories.
Essays, of course, she has to correct me. Essays, not stories, essays, serious stuff.
It's a different
But it's also a good read. So you can see, subscribe to the newsletter. You'll hear more about what's happening with Mira's book. And of course, we have taken it to we always take a few of our books to the Melbourne International Film Festival. Pauline does that very, very well. And she, talks the books up and whatever. It's very rare when a book gets taken up. We have one book taken up, which will be made into a film. But, maybe Mira, you can sort of use your underground network a bit too, because Grace Marigold would make a fabulous film, I think. It would really, really, and it would be very good for young lesbians to actually see that, those were the days. It could be like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think I probably said enough.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Renata, and thank you everybody for participating this evening. And we hope to see you again very soon at another launch. We've got 3 and, this and this and this. We've got coming up 29th and the 4th are the next ones. So please do come. Thank you.